Welcome back to the Al Monitor Brief. I'm Adam Lucente. Today, Wednesday, January 7th, is proving to be one of the most influential days in recent Yemeni history. As I sit here in the Al Monitor newsroom, pro-Yemeni government forces are advancing towards the Southern Transitional Council's stronghold of Aden, after retaking key parts of the Hadramaut province from the southern separatists. That was only one of the major developments that occurred today. Let's break it down. The Saudi-led coalition, which backs the Yemeni government forces, issued a statement earlier on Wednesday saying STC leader Aidarus Zubaydi had, quote, fled after he was supposed to fly to Riyadh for talks on the situation. The coalition accused him of mobilizing forces in the Adala province and distributing weapons in Aden, prompting them to strike the former. The Presidential Leadership Council, which leads the government, then said Zubaydi had been expelled from the body. For its part, the STC said the Saudi strikes had killed civilians, and that Zubaydi stayed in Aden to carry out his duties. They also said that they hadn't heard from other members of the organization who had gone to Riyadh for the talks, although one STC official later said on X that he was in the city for the negotiations. Another member of the Southern Transitional Council accused Saudi Arabia of, quote, treachery and betrayal. At this point, let's take a minute to just quickly go over the various sides in the Yemeni civil war. The war began in 2014 between the government and the Iran-backed Houthi rebels. Saudi Arabia formed a military coalition to back the government in 2015. The Southern Transitional Council wants an independent South Yemen. It's worth noting that South Yemen was independent for much of the 20th century, and they are part of the government alliance against the Houthis. The war started to calm down after a 6-month truce in 2022, and Saudi Arabia began talks with the Houthis that year. However, the STC, which is backed by the United Arab Emirates, launched a major offensive largely in Hadramaut in December. They made significant gains, but those gains have now been reversed. Saudi Arabia conducted many strikes in Yemen after the STC offensive and criticized the UAE for supporting the STC near their border. The UAE then said they would be withdrawing from Yemen in what is turning out to be the biggest rift in the Gulf since the 2007 Qatar diplomatic crisis. It's also worth noting that Al-Qaeda has a presence in Yemen, as does ISIS. So what's next? In this episode, I spoke to the author of Al Monitor's Gulf newsletter, Francesco Schiavi. Francesco takes us through the significance of the momentum shift in Yemen, the rationale behind Saudi Arabia's assertive posture, and whether the UAE will be able to maintain influence in the country following the STC's losses. Hope you enjoy. Francesco, welcome back to the Al Monitor Brief.
Thank you for having me, Adam. It's great to be here.
So there's a lot to get to in Yemen. I mean, at first I wanted to get your reaction. At the time of recording, it seems that the Presidential Council has expelled Az-Zubaydi and accused him of high treason. The council itself has confirmed that Zubaydi did not board a plane that was en route to Riyadh and has condemned the new Saudi airstrikes in the country. What is your reaction to all these events? What's the significance?
Yeah, over the past 24 hours, as you mentioned, we have seen a rapid and highly consequential escalation in southern Yemen that has fundamentally changed the political landscape, in my opinion. So the Saudi-led coalition said it carried out what it calls limited preemptive strikes in southern governorate of Al-Dalia, targeting camps and convoys, it says, were being prepared by forces loyal to the Southern Transitional Council, the STC leader, Aidarus Zubaydi. There has been casualties reported by local hospitals. So according to the coalition, the strikes came just hours before Zubaydi was supposed to board on a plane to Riyadh for Saudi-hosted talks on the southern issue. But as you mentioned, he did not board the flight. Saudi officials claim his whereabouts are unknown, while the STC insists he remains in Aden. But what triggered the strikes, according to Saudi and Yemeni government sources, was intelligence indicating that Zubaydi was delaying his departure in order to reposition forces, move weapons, including heavy weapons, artillery, and armor, and prepare for, let's say, escalation or resistance, particularly around Adalia, which is home area. For Riyadh's perspective, this crossed a critical line, transforming, let's say, hesitation into preparation for rebellion. So Politically, the response was unprecedented. As you mentioned, Yemen's internationally recognized government body, the Presidential Leadership Council, the PLC, issued a decree removing al-Zubaydi from his position and referring him to the prosecutor, let's say, or on charges including high treason and forming armed groups outside state authority, referring to him also as a rebel. And also two ministers were also dismissed, accused of, let's say, supplying weapons to fighters loyal to him. So, in short, what we are seeing is not just another flare-up, but it's a decisive attempt by Saudi Arabia to prevent secessionists a fait accompli, while neutralize a defiant leader and also pull the southern file back into a negotiated framework, all while the situation on the ground remains extremely fluid. And that rapid escalation over the last days helps explain why the broader Saudi-UAE rift and the future of southern Yemen maybe has suddenly become the central story again.
When I was first preparing for this podcast, I thought, maybe the UAE Saudi tensions over Yemen have calmed down after the UAE announced that it is withdrawing from Yemen. But then we had the government make many advances against the STC. We had this news with Az-Zubaydi, and we also had the STC declaration of seeking, self-determination. What is your view? Like, where do the tensions between the UAE and Saudi Arabia stand as of now?
Let's say where things stand right now is that the immediate risk of an open Saudi-UAE confrontation has been reduced, of course, but the political rupture between them has not been repaired. And I also think that Yemen is where that rupture is now most visible. So over the past month, events in southern Yemen have moved from tension to outright shock. The UAE's decision to withdraw its remaining forces helped cool the diplomatic temperature and avoid a direct clash between Gulf capitals. But as we have seen, it did not dismantle Emirati influence on the ground. Abu Dhabi's leverage in the south rests less on troop presence and more on long-standing political, military, and financial ties with local actors, above all the STC, which controls Aden and feels and oil field, some of the most capable forces in southern Yemen also. On the other side, we have Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, that has drawn a very clear line. Riyadh is not opposed to discussing southern grievances politically, but it is fundamentally opposed to a unilateral secessionist trajectory, especially one that spills into eastern governorates like Hadramaut and Al-Mahra. These are areas borders Saudi Arabia and Oman and sits along key land and maritime routes linking the Arabian Peninsula to the Indian Ocean. And from a Saudi perspective, allowing a UAE-aligned secessionist entity to consolidate control where they will represent a direct national security threat. So to sum up, what we are seeing now is Saudi Arabia shifting from mediation to enforcement. It is using three tools at once. So first, Yemeni institutional legitimacy through the PLC, the Presidential Leadership Council, limited but decisive military force to reverse fait accompli, and political pressure to fracture the southern leadership. The UAE has stepped back tactically while preserving long-term influence networks. So tensions have not disappeared, they have become more structural, with Yemen as the arena where, let's say, competing visions could now collide.
As we know, the Council's forces made a lot of advances in Hadramaut last month, but since then we've seen the government make some gains, and now we have this renewed pressure that you're talking about on the STC. Do you think there's been like a momentum shift in this conflict in the last few weeks or even days?
Yes, there is a momentum shift. We have seen the maps changing rapidly over the last weeks. But I think that it is not primarily a battlefield victory. It's a shift into political leverage and in who controls escalation. So militarily, the Saudi-backed National Shield Forces, NSF, rolled back the STC Eastern expansion into Hadramaut and Al-Mahra, as we mentioned. That intervention reversed Azubaydi's momentum and signaled that Riyadh was willing to enforce red lines tied to border security and Red Sea accesses, controlling key strategic points. But these gains alone do not dismantle the STC core power base, which remain strongest in Aden and nearby southwestern governorates. Again, the more consequential shift, in my opinion, is political. Over the past days, Saudi Arabia steadily weakened the position of Aidarus al-Zubaydi, the president of the STC and the symbolic face of Southern secessionism. He was formally invited to Riyadh and given a 48-hour window to attend Saudi-sponsored talks that, as we mentioned, from Riyadh's perspective, could have marked one of the biggest, let's say, diplomatic breakthroughs of the Yemen war by having the leader of the secessionist movement into a negotiated political process based in the Saudi capital. But instead, by delaying his departure first and then repositioning forces across let's say, a triangle stretching from Adalia to Abiyan and Aden, al-Zubaydi signaled, let's say, at least readiness for confrontation rather than negotiation. We cannot say that it's opening. We don't know yet if all of these movements were meant to stage a counterattack or entrench STC's forces loyal to al-Zubaydi's in the area. But anyways, from Riyadh's perspective, this stopped being a diplomatic issue and became an internal security emergency. So not about missed talks, but about preempting an armed challenge to the internationally recognized government. That interpretation explains the speed and severity of the Saudi response. So we have limited preemptive strikes, his removal from the governing council, and charges including high treason, which is a serious accusation under Yemeni law, potentially carrying the most severe penalties, is something that we should not forget. And at the same time, Saudi-backed messaging explicitly urged communities in Aden, Adalia, and others not to follow him or into another round of war. So this also exposes a deeper miscalculation. It was not only military but social. So after 10 years of conflict, southern Yemen is exhausted. The secessionist sentiment still exists, but it competes with far more immediate concerns. So salaries, fuel, electricity, security, so basic services. And assuming that war-weary communities would automatically rally behind a new escalation appears increasingly fragile. So Azubaydi here made a deep miscalculation, I think. So to answer your question, the momentum has shifted towards Saudi Arabia regaining control over the tempo of events and narrowing the space for unilateral secessionism, even though the STC remain a powerful actor in Yemen, of course.
Francesco, taking a step back, I think this would be important for the listeners to go over. I mean, why does the UAE, or they have supported for a long time, the Southern Transitional Council, and why has Saudi Arabia for years backed the government? Why is there a difference between them, and why do they each think that said policy is in their interests?
Okay, so the divergence is structural and rooted in fundamentally different security philosophies and strategies, of course, and interests. For Saudi Arabia, Yemen is first and foremost a border security and state integrity issue. Since launching the war 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago in 2015, Riyadh wanted a single internationally recognized Yemeni authority that can manage borders, negotiate agreements, and ensure stability along the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb. Let's say this is also the Saudi approach, multilateral approach, is a state-to-state approach that that it followed since the start of the war more than a decade ago. And this is why Saudi Arabia has invested so heavily in formal institutions like the Presidential Leadership Council and continues to defend Yemen's territorial unity, even if governance remains, of course, fragile. We have the Houthis, who controls a large swath and one of the most important area of the north of the country. The UAE has approached, let's say, the UAE approaches Yemen from a totally different angle. Also because of the different size of the two countries. The UAE are smaller countries than Saudi Arabia. It has more a Machiavellian approach to geopolitical, to how to expand its geopolitical influence. So Abu Dhabi prioritized, let's say, in this case, being involved in Yemen means prioritizing maritime security, counterterrorism, and control of strategic nodes such as ports, coastlines, and shipping lanes. So rather than relying on weak central institutions, it prefers working through strong local partners that can deliver security on the ground. In Yemen, the SDC fits this model. It controls Aden, commands disciplined forces, some of the most well-trained and equipped forces in Yemen, and offers leverage along the Gulf of Aden. So, and also it's also reportedly known that the UAE has over the last years built a network of small bases all around the southern approach of the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb area. And of course, all the islands that are officially under the control of, that are still part of the Yemen territory, are central in this approach. Just to quickly summarize, but to make it clear to our followers, Saudi Arabia wants to keep Yemen all together as a single country to decrease instability coming from its southern border, while the UAE are more focused on, let's say, enhancing the control of a specific faction within the Yemeni context. The SCC is let's say, it's an umbrella. First of all, the SCC is an umbrella term to define a big swap of different Yemeni factions that have been constantly under the influence of Abu Dhabi. Overall, the clash becomes unavoidable when these two models collide, as we have seen over the last month. Saudi Arabia sees the SCC's eastern expansion as a direct threat to its borders and to the state framework it has spent years trying to preserve, while the UAE sees the STC as a reflection of realities on the ground and, let's say, a reliable partner for securing strategic corridors. So, to put it simply, Saudi Arabia prioritizes sovereignty and borders, and the UAE prioritizes functional control of maritime and logistical choke points. And probably Yemen is where those priorities collide most sharply.
Yeah, the point about the maritime corridors in the Red Sea is a good transition to the last question. I mean, what other regional theaters do you think are influencing this UAE-Saudi rivalry in Yemen, but also in general? I mean, specifically, I'm thinking of the Sudan War and the Israeli recognition of Somaliland and also the UAE's connections in the Horn of Africa. Is that influencing their rivalry at all?
Yes, of course, very directly. Yemen is, of course, one of the nodes in a much wider contest over the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. You mentioned Sudan. The conflict has increasingly become a struggle over ports, coastlines, and Red Sea access. Control on one side of the water immediately raised the strategic value of influence on the other. So for Saudi Arabia, which faces Sudan across let's say, a long Red Sea coastline, instability there cannot be separated from what happens in Yemen, of course. While at the same time, Somaliland, you mentioned it, adds another layer. Any move toward recognizing breakaway entities along the Gulf of Aden reinforces Saudi fears of fragmentation spreading across the region. for Riyadh, allowing a secessionist project to succeed in Southern Yemen would set a dangerous precedent at a time when, let's say, parallel authorities are emerging elsewhere. And this is something that is not just affecting Saudi Arabia's approach to the region. We know that many other actors, let's say, for example, Turkey, Egypt, which over the last days have had constant interaction with the Saudi authorities, have expressed their interest and their over the stability over this region. And of course, they are totally in line with Saudi's vision of integrity, of preserving the integrity of these states. While on the other hand, we have other countries, for example, the UAE and Israel, you mentioned them, which have more interest in leveraging separatist movements to enhance their presence, to put a foothold into these countries. We have seen the UAE support of the RSF in Sudan, the UAE chain of bases and islands in the Red Sea, but also its bases in Berbera, which is in Somaliland, but also in Puntland. So we have these two regions in northern Somalia that have long secessionist sentiment, and they are exploiting them to their interests. So overall, of course, Yemen is just one part of this broader regional situation where external actors are putting their resources to try to exploit the situation for the best interest. So at the same time, Yemen today effectively has, let's say, three power centers. We have to mention the Houthis in the north, of course. We have the Saudi government in Aden led by Rashad al-Alimi, and southern separatist forces centered around the STC. So overall, further fragmentation risks creating vacuums, and those vacuums have historically been exploited by also groups like other actors, not last like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So overall, the link is, let's say, strategic rather than transactional, I think. As probably we will see competition intensify, competition will intensify over ports, trade routes, and maritime choke points, and Yemen becomes in this framework more consequential, not less. So what happens there will shape security along one of the world's most important shipping corridors, of course.
Francesco, thanks a lot for your time and all these insights, and we look forward to more of your newsletters and reporting on these topics.
Thank you so much, Adam. Always great to be with you.
Thanks for listening to the Al Monitor Brief. Be sure to follow Al Monitor for more on the stories impacting the Middle East. Until next time, I'm Adam Lucente.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.